Dear friends, I'm glad to welcome all of you here on Feygin Live channel. We have our stream. Today is 24th of September. It's Sunday. The time is 9 p.m. in Kiev and in Moscow. Our guest today is Yuri Felshtinsky, historian, a famous writer. Yuri, hello. Hello, good evening. We called our stream Weapons and Elections, and a still image for our stream is the latest visit of Zelensky to New York, to the General Assembly of the UN. He met with Biden in Washington, and they made all the statements. Presidential election in America next year in November clearly influences Biden's administration and the way they provide support for Ukraine. We can see some indicators and information, and we see that the Republican majority in the Congress blocks some decisions or publicly criticizes the decisions of Biden administration related to support of Ukraine, and that impacts the war. How would you explain the fact, Yuri, that first Biden's administration said that the ATACAMS issue is not settled, and they said publicly that they're not going to give ATACAMS to Ukraine, and then next day some of the media in the States said that they'll give submunition ATACAMS to Ukraine, but in limited numbers. Why do they do that? They're doing it not to irritate Moscow, or they're being extra cautious and confidential, kind of saying they're not going to give it and then give it, or maybe there are some other reasons. That's the first question. How would you explain this maneuvering? Well, first of all, this is one of those issues that doesn't have to do much with election and those publications that you mentioned. And the problem is as follows, and I spoke about it. This war can be finished within 2 weeks. It could have been finished within 2 weeks 19 months ago. Actually, it is exactly 19 months ago. Or it can be finished within 2 weeks now. To do this, Ukraine should receive offensive weapons, and Ukraine should be allowed to use these weapons to hit the Russian territory. This is how this war can be won. There is no any other way to win this war. So, in other words, if they don't do it, then the war won't be won and the war just continues. And it doesn't mean that Ukraine will lose, right? So, yes, the war won't be lost by Ukraine and its allies, but the war can't be won. So in this format that we see now, how the war is going, and probably Putin didn't realize it right away, but right now it's clear that in this format, Russia can fight this war infinitely, because they launch strikes on Ukraine only, and Russia loses a lot of people, and Russia doesn't care. Russia loses money, and Russia doesn't care. They produce enough weapons in Russia, and let's be frank, the USSR and Russia now, they were the second producer in the world, a weapon producer. And counting on Russia is going to be running out of money and people, it's not right. In the format when Russia is hitting Ukraine and Ukraine is fighting back, in best case hitting Sevastopol, the city that Russia occupied. So given this, Russia can fight this war infinitely. American support is 50% of the support that is given to Ukraine. Americans and Europe, they're gradually shifting to understanding that Ukraine should be given offensive weapons. That is why a year ago or half a year ago, they told Ukraine that certain types of weapons Ukraine would never get. Nevertheless, Americans and Europeans, they're going to give this and that, and let's give F-16 to Ukraine. And if it's not us, Americans give F-16 to Ukraine, let Danes give F-16 to Ukraine. Clearly, America is beginning to understand that if there is a goal to finish the war, and there is this goal, both America and the EU, they need to give Ukraine more offensive weapons and let Ukraine hit the Russian territory. Well, not yet. They didn't get to this point, and the EU didn't get to this point. And every time they emphasize, yes, we give these weapons, but you can use these weapons only to hit those occupied territories, not Russian territory. And let me underline it, and this is a simple truth. You can't win the war if you don't hit the territory of Russian Federation with modern weapons. Because obviously some strikes are launched, some drones are sent to Russian territory, they hit some neighboring territories of Russia, and these are done with Ukrainian weapons, and the quality of these weapons is not as modern. In order to finish the war, Ukraine should receive modern weapons, and the restrictions to use these weapons on the Russian territory should be lifted. And now we may touch on presidential election, Republicans and Trump. So what Putin counts on? It has been 19 months of the war. The election in the US is far, but not that far after the first 19 months of war. And of course now they seriously hope that Trump will win. And if Trump wins, then yes, he'll stop all support of Ukraine. He may decide that the United States should leave NATO or completely withdraw from this remote war, which is so far away from American strategic interests, this Russo-Ukrainian war. Can he make this decision unilaterally? Some of your opponents from Republicans, they say that he doesn't have these intentions, and if even he had these intentions, his presidential powers don't let him make such decisions. Stop this weapon shipments. He can't make these decisions without the consent of the Congress and law enforcement agencies. Okay, let me put it like this. First of all, in 2016, Trump, in his foreign policy speech in Mayflower Hotel, he said that NATO is an obsolete organization and the US should leave this institution. I have to emphasize that this speech for Trump was written in Moscow, and this is not an exaggeration. Dimitri Simes, Simes, former, he is a high-rank Soviet agent. He was planted in the US long ago. He made quite a good career, and he is still functioning. he had some failures, and he had to return to Moscow and become a political commentator on the first channel of Russian TV, because he had to get some money from Russia, and the best way to do that was through the fees from the Russian TV. But he wasn't touched. He was afraid that he could be arrested after Miller's proceedings, Miller's investigation, but somehow he got away. So, first point, foreign policy program of Trump was written in Moscow. Point two, American president, for good or for bad, has unlimited capabilities to realize all foreign policy plans. With all the rest, the American president is bound hand and foot. And to realize his foreign policy plans, the American president has dictator's powers at the first stage of realizing those policy plans. And of course, within the first 6 months, the Congress is supposed to approve of it or not. But at the first stage, the President of the United States has unlimited capabilities. When Trump recently said that he'll stop the war in Ukraine within 24 hours, it is absolutely clear what he meant. He meant that within 24 hours he'll say that he stops all support of Ukraine and he withdraws America from this conflict between Russia and Ukraine. That's why when he says that the war will be ended in 24 hours, he means that he will give up Ukraine in 24 hours. And then how the EU and Ukraine fight with Russia, Trump will watch it on TV. So this is a real threat, real danger. Trump's coming in power again, and how it will impact the US participation in the Russo-Ukrainian war, I think it's quite a danger. And I think that's the only danger. And we all know that there is a certain tension that has to do with Republicans' view on the support of Ukraine. And I think that in many ways it has to do with the pre-election situation and Trump's candidacy. Republicans are in a very difficult situation. In what sense? Well, actually, Democrats, they also have their challenges, and we shouldn't forget about them. But let's discuss Republicans. The Republican Party would probably give a lot not to see Trump in the political arena, but the problem is that he is not disappearing. He's still there. Moreover, Republicans know, and know it very well, that if they impede Trump's nomination from the Republican Party, then Trump will announce creation of a new party. Do you think it's guaranteed? Yes, it is. Because the third party, this will be a loss of Republican candidates. Yes, absolutely right. Absolutely right. We can give an example of Jill Stein. Remember, she pulled votes away from Democrats in those states where Democrats lost their critical minority, those votes that Clinton needed for the victory. And Trump understands that if he announces himself as an independent candidate, he will pull away not 2% of the votes, he will pull away 10-15% of the votes, and Republicans will lose 100%, and Republicans know that. So that's why the choice that the Republican Party faces is to either announce Trump as a candidate from the Republican Party, or to kind of sign a death sentence for themselves. I mean, political sentence, so to speak, and they will just lose the election. And since the Republicans don't want to lose the election to Democrats, so we shouldn't expect that they won't nominate Trump as a candidate from the Republican Party, and then we'll see what will be happening. The problem is, and we understand that, we may have a different attitude to Biden. Some people support him completely, some partially, some stand against him. But Biden is a very old man, and we should be frank that we're very much concerned whether he's going to make it to the election. Will he win? Will he stumble on the steps, literally, right in front of the cameras and the whole America? Won't he faint or get sick or something like that? And this is the factor that we need to keep in mind. I would actually give a lot that Biden wouldn't go for the second term. It would be great if he could have found a good replacement for himself, but as we see, it didn't happen. And if I remember it correctly, when Biden was becoming a president, he said that he is not going to run for the second term. But it seems that he changed his mind. So that's why let's hope that he will be well and healthy and he'll get to the elections, and we will see what American voters decide. But Trump is a very serious danger for stability in the world. And all those people who think, and I don't know what their calculations are based on, they think that he'll continue supporting Ukraine. I think they're very wrong. They're very much mistaken. What we know about Trump, and it doesn't matter what is your attitude to him, whether you consider him honest or dishonest, smart or stupid, Trump has quite a specific relationship with Russia. He has very serious financial ties with Russia. He is not an independent political figure. If we look at his relationship with Russia, and there are many other reasons to think that Trump has connections with Russian special services. The fact is that Russian special services consider Trump their man, and what Trump thinks about it, it's a completely different issue. What's important is that the Kremlin and Lubyanka, the FSB office, consider Trump their man. That's obvious. Okay, we've been on air for 19 minutes. We have some time to go. And based on your analysis that this is a real threat, I mean November of 2024 and inauguration at the end of January of 2025, if Trump wins, does it mean that Ukraine is running out of time? Meaning that it has to deoccupy these 80–90% of the occupied territories in the east and the south, and they have to launch their counteroffensive in spring. That should reduce significantly this occupied area. Or it's too little time and Ukraine won't be able to deoccupy such territories using military force. Then there must be some other plan. This is what you said, to create a problem within Russia. And I used to talk about it too. And I say it meaning that within Russian government there must be challenges that Russia has to deal with, like it was on the 23rd of June. And we actually had a stream on that day when that mutiny happened, and I was reading this news that the base of uh, Wagner Group was attacked in the south, and it ended as it ended, and then we had other stream. So, and what it tells us, there must be a similar situation in Russia, and probably Ukraine should provoke this situation because Ukraine has the most interest in this, or there can be the Russian opposition that can do it. This can be a Russian volunteer corps, the Freedom of Russia Legion, and then Russian authority will be distracted to these problems, and they won't be dealing with Tokmak or Bakhmut in Ukraine. Or another way to do it is to launch missile strikes on Moscow or drones, or some cities that are closer to the central part of Russia. And this is a problem, and it should be resolved. And if Ukraine has enough missiles to hit Russia, then Moscow will have to deal with these problems when the Rublevsky highway will be hit. And Moscow might forget about Melitopol or Mariupol or other cities. So what position do you think the Kiev government should take to deal with this? To intensify the military operation or to change their strategy? First of all, it's not Ukraine who is running out of time. It is Europe and the United States, but it actually impacts Ukraine. Well, yes, it does, of course. And of course, Ukraine is interested in support. But let's be frank. The victory of Ukraine is in the strategic interest of Europe and the United States, and those people in the United States, and there are such people, by the way, they write those texts and send those messages, and these messages come from Republican leadership, and they argue that America shouldn't spend money on the war that is not part of the strategic interests of the United States. They are, to the best, mistaken, and to the worst, they are intentionally misleading American public opinion. Ukrainian victory in this war is in strategic interests of the United States and Europe. And that's why when we say that somebody is running out of time regarding American election and the theoretical possibility of Trump's victory, here we're talking about the time crunch for Europe and for the United States. I mean, that part of the United States that is not strictly pro-Trump, and they think that Ukraine should be saved, despite the fact that Trump thinks differently. See, I spoke about it many times, and I tried to say it softly, and it was incorrect to speak harsh. Ukraine doesn't have a chance to quickly win through an offensive in the east and in the south. It's impossible, and it's impossible due to the same reasons that Russia can make quick advances in the east and in the south. They are fighting a positional war, and in a positional war it's very hard to achieve quick results for both parties, and we know that from the history of the First World War. That's because they have this military parity, right? Yes, of course. Because for many months of the occupation, and it has been 19 months, For this time, Russia managed to build very serious fortifications, a very strong defense line, and Russia doesn't have a lack of manpower. Russia is a great country with an unlimited resources of human flesh, and it can throw it in the trenches. And we witness it for 19 months. That's why Russia's losses are quite significant, but in no way it can impact additional mobilization. We may be skeptical about Russian weapons, and if Russia has serious types of weapons, this is engineer corps and artillery. Russia has very good engineer corps, pretty good artillery, and it will be very hard to break through these defense lines in a frontal attack. It may happen, but it will be achieved with serious human losses for Ukraine and time losses. I don't think that this approach is a dead-end approach. Maybe it is right, but it's right if it's done as part of the change of the general strategy, and the change of the strategy should be this: Ukraine hits the territory of Russian Federation, and as I said many times, firstly, Moscow should be hit. And based on the example of 23rd and 24th of June, and it's good that you mentioned those events of mutiny, we clearly understood it again. That's the only painful point in Russia is Moscow. So as soon as some strange forces commanded by this guy Utkin move into Moscow, and they were far away from Moscow, and right away, you know, the whole region of Moscow was feverish. Putin ran away, Medvedev ran away. Everybody was panicking. They cancelled everything in Moscow. Everybody hid in the corners. You couldn't see a soul. And that's just because of one tweet of that guy Utkin. Yeah, I think they wrote it in the Telegram. Yeah, and let alone all those oligarchs who jumped on their private jets and flew away. That's why I can hardly imagine what may happen to Russia if Moscow is hit. It's very hard to imagine what's going to happen to this house of cards, and it turned out to be a house of cards and not a vertical of power as we realized on the 24th of June. So all this will disappear. There was no a single soul that would stand for Putin. None of them. And remember how deplorable he looked in the evening on the 24th of June when he was allowed to return to Moscow. And I emphasize, they allowed him to come back to Moscow. What the conditions were and who allowed him to do that. So, therefore, counteroffensive is a great thing, but the counteroffensive is not going to give much to the general strategy to achieve the victory of Ukraine in this war, sadly. And counting on that something is going to happen to Russia, that there will be some forces that do something in Russia, there will be some people who will stop this war and all that. No, I think these calculations are wrong. So they're not going to stop this war, and they don't stop this war because don't forget that it wasn't incidental that they prohibited to use the word war. We were kind of mocking it. So war, so nobody can say war, nobody can call the war a war. But in fact, on their side, it was the right decision, because from the point of view of Russia as a state, there is no war, there is nothing to finish. There is no war. There are some military actions that are happening on the territory of Ukraine, not in Russia, right? Yes. And it's not a war. These are military actions that happen in the territory of Ukraine. It's either NATO is fighting, or Bandera troops are fighting, or Ukrainians are fighting. There is no war, there is nothing to finish for them. So the whole world is trying to figure out how to finish this Russo-Ukrainian war under any conditions. But Russia is not fighting any war. There is nothing to finish for them. And this is the mindset of the people in Russia. And in order to change this mindset, yes, sadly, they should hit Moscow, because all other regions, all these provincial towns, nobody cares about them. Provincial towns hate Moscow, and Moscow despises provincial towns. So that's why they need to hit Moscow. And I spoke about it many times, and for many months I spoke about it, and there is nothing new for our viewers in this. Until they hit Moscow, they can't win this war. And it's not even winning in this war. Maybe after that it will be difficult to win it anyway, but from the point of view of Russians, there is no war. Nothing is going on. And if you listen to what Muscovites say, everything just rosy for them. All those who are still in Moscow. And let me make a reservation. A couple of days ago, for a few days, I was in Istanbul. And if it's not Turkish language, then the main language in Istanbul today is Russian. Right now I'm in Warsaw, and I come to Warsaw quite regularly. 7 years ago, in Warsaw, you couldn't find a person who would speak Russian. Now, every other person in Warsaw speaks Russian. Well, there can be Ukrainians, refugees, yes, of course, Ukrainians, Belarusians, but also Russians. So let's be blunt. Those who felt uncomfortable due to whatever reasons, financial, family reasons, psychological reasons, all those who were uncomfortable, they left Moscow and left Russia. So therefore, I would say that it's okay to hit Moscow, because by doing this, they can change the mind of those Muscovites who are still there, who don't understand that the war is going on. Those who know that the war is going, they left, and no matter what the reasons were. There were many people who deep inside Russian patriots, and maybe they support Russia and support Putin, but nevertheless they left the country. So therefore, if our goal is to stop Russia, and we have this goal, then Moscow must be hit. And now back to Republicans and Trump. Well, Trump is a separate topic, because in one way or another he is an agent of Moscow. Whether it happened consciously or unconsciously, whether he signed any paper or not, there is a certain reality. Trump is Moscow's man in Washington, and if he is in the White House, Moscow will have its man in the White House. It should be understood that stopping supporting Ukraine and giving up Ukraine, it's not going to improve the state of Europe and the United States. If we keep in mind that there is confrontation between the United States and the aggressive leadership of Moscow. Because we understand very well that now it seems that we are talking about Ukraine, but in fact we are not talking about Ukraine. We are talking about restoration of the Soviet Empire or Russian Empire, whatever you call it, because several days ago they erected the monument to Dzerzhinsky, the head of KGB, the founder of KGB. It's not in the center of Moscow now. They put it up at the building of the Foreign Intelligence Service. But maybe later, and it's smaller, and maybe later they will make it bigger and put it back in the center of Moscow, in the Lubyanskaya Square, near the FSB building. This trend can be changed. It can be stopped only through Russia's defeat in this war that it's waged against Ukraine. I know that everybody is concerned that the United States might stop its support of Ukraine, but I am not concerned because, let me repeat, that continuing resistance of Ukraine in some way is more in the interest of Europe and the United States than in Ukraine's interest. In some way, Ukraine is doing a great favor to Europe and the United States, resisting Russia, that Ukraine didn't give up on the 24th of February of 2022, and Putin counted on that surrender, and many intelligence services in the world thought it might have happened. Right now, Ukraine is doing a huge, heroic favor to Europe and the United States. And for Europe, you know, the closer European countries are to the Russian border, the bigger the favor is of Ukraine. Now we hear a lot of news that Poland stops its support of Ukraine. But I can guarantee you that Poland will not stop its support of Ukraine, because military support of Poland to Ukraine is mostly in the interest of Poland itself, and they understand it in Poland. And I don't know how this announcement appeared, how this news appeared, and who made this announcement. I think it's Morawiecki, the Prime Minister of Poland. I think it was either confusion or misunderstanding, but I don't think that it may stop Poland from giving help to Ukraine, because Poland knows that it will be next. Well, maybe Lithuania, but then Poland. People understand it in Poland, in Lithuania, in Latvia, and Estonia, since these countries are members of NATO. They do have a voting right in the organization. And this is what actually saves the day. This is what keep pushing NATO to help Ukraine. And this is what influences the United States, that can't leave NATO and that can't give up on Ukraine. And a separate topic is Trump, what's going to happen when Trump comes in power, and nothing good is going to happen if he is in power. But if we isolate the factor of Trump, then I would say that Republican opposition to supporting Ukraine is a part of the presidential campaign, because Republicans, they need to find some sort of cracks in Democrats' defense and find weak spots in Biden's policy. And if we believe polls in America, the results of them say that some Americans think that support of Ukraine should be suspended. So they're the latest sociological surveys in the US. We shouldn't think that those surveys were kind of falsified in a certain way. No, how representative they are. Formally speaking, those results of those polls, they're probably right. But between us, let's say that financial support that America provides for Ukraine does not impact the economic situation in the United States. I wouldn't say it's just pennies for the US, but frankly, if you look at it, they are pennies. And these polls probably are just another indicator that Americans were not explained what's going on. And clearly, if you ask an average American whether they want their money to go to Ukraine, then we need to understand that this average American should have a certain political understanding of the political situation in Europe and conflict between Russia and Ukraine for them to say that they want their money to go to Ukraine. I think that this is way too much to demand from Americans to say yes, yes, yes to supporting Ukraine. I don't think that there is a situation in which an American taxpayer will say just like that, yes, I want my money to be spent on some foreign policy actions. Americans, in this sense, they're kind of provincial. America is a great country, no doubt, but in terms of international news, you won't see a lot of them on TV in the US. In many ways, America is living in some sort of self-isolation. On the one hand, it is a great power, but on the other hand, they don't care about any other story except for domestic story. And they're not involved in what's going on around the world personally, so to speak. There are these polls, but I don't think that these polls, they actually determine American policy. Because in the United States, if we talk about foreign policy, the issues and the level of those issues are determined by the government and by the White House and the President, and to a lesser extent by others. So that's why I don't see this danger. The danger that support of Ukraine will be suspended. And again, if we don't factor in Trump, because I think that everybody who has anything to do with foreign policy and they understand what Russia is today, who Putin is, everybody who know that, they know that the cheapest or even free way to resist Russian aggression is to support Ukraine. All other variants are very expensive and very painful for Europe, first of all. So back to the American policy. Not giving Ukraine the required weapons, doing it quickly and effectively, even on the side of the Biden administration, that is the main ally of Ukraine. What is the reason for that? Fear of Moscow, the possibility of a nuclear war. some other calculations of the Republican Party, maybe Sullivan Burns and Austin Blinken groups fight. Where is the key to understanding this complex processes and those delays of weapon shipments? They promised fighter jets in the summer, but they're going to provide them only in the spring of the next year. Now they promised submunition ATACAMS, and they're gonna give them, but what are the numbers, how many, and all that. So there is always a delay, there is always something there. So what Americans are afraid of? But actually you gave several factors and variants, right? And I would say all of them, all four of them. Are they afraid of nuclear confrontation? Yes, they're afraid of it. And we know that this is one of the most serious factors. And the only and the main factor, that's why on day one they didn't make a decision to make a no-flight zone in Ukraine, and they didn't give Ukraine offensive weapons, and they didn't allow Ukraine to hit the Russian territory. We may make fun of tweets and telegram messages of ex-President Medvedev, and he was threatening the whole world before the 24th of June that Russia may launch a nuclear strike on Europe. And after June 24th, he's going to stop doing that. But of course, it's a factor, and experts in the US and in Europe, they're trying to assess whether this threat is real or it's bluff. Yes, it is a factor. Are there people in the US who think that if Russia loses and it will fall apart and there will be 125 different states and there were 125 threats? Yes, there are such people in the United States, and I think they're wrong, mildly speaking, and they're mistaken. I think that to assume that in Russia there can be worse leadership than the one that is in power today, it is similar to thinking that Hitler shouldn't be dethroned, that the one who comes after him is going to be worse. No, right now, nothing can be worse in Russia than the people that are running Russia today. Well, there are other talks. They say that the delays in weapon shipments is a factor of pressuring Kiev. And even Zelensky, when he spoke at the General Assembly of the UN, he said that there were some strange consultations behind the scenes. And Minister of Foreign Affairs Dimitri Kuleba said that the fall for Ukraine will be very difficult because Ukraine will be pushed to start negotiations with Russia. Maybe this is a factor. You see, in America and in Europe, there are people who think that it is possible to agree on something with Putin and to agree on something with Ukraine. The problem is that it's impossible to agree on anything with Putin. Yes, of course, it is impossible, but they don't think so. But in the fact is that because they don't think so, nothing changes actually. By thinking so, they can't make negotiations successful. They think that the war should be stopped as a result of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. But it changes nothing. Let's be frank. To make negotiations successful, both parties must want to get at the negotiations table. And actually, they should be ready to compromise. Yes, they should be ready for negotiations and to make concessions, right? But here we have two parties who don't want to get to the negotiation table and to make concessions. Russia is not ready to make concessions because Russia didn't change its foreign policy goals since February 24th of 2022. Russia still makes the point to destroy Ukraine as a state and to devour all territory over Ukraine. And all other statements that actually don't come from Putin, I would say they're more like a war trick. When Peskov makes, Putin's spokesman makes these announcements that yes, we are ready to consider some territories and partly stay with us and partly go back to Ukraine. On the one hand, we have the Russian Federation that wants whole Ukraine, but actually it wants more than just Ukraine, because as soon as Russia gets Ukraine, and some people think that sooner or later Russia will get it, since the war is going and they're going to obliterate the whole Ukraine, they just kill everybody and they'll take over Ukraine, and then they move on. They take over Moldova, then Baltic states. But from the point of view of Ukraine, and Ukraine knows that it is going to happen, that there are not going to be any partial annexation of Ukraine, because as soon as Russia settles with annexation of a certain territory, it will move on, just like it was with Crimea, and Ukraine knows that. That's why there is no Ukrainian politician, starting with Zelensky. They can't even raise an issue of peace negotiations with Russia under the conditions that could be different than the borders of 1991. Ukraine says that yes, we can sign the peace treaty right away as soon as Russia accepts the conditions of borders of 1991. And of course, as soon as these conditions are accepted, the war will be over. Or at least some of the main points to finish the war will be settled. But that's not going to happen because Russia is not going to sign these conditions, because Russia has absolutely different goals. Russia's goals are to continue confrontation with the United States through territorial takeovers in Europe, returning those vantage grounds that the Soviet Union had in Eastern Europe. That's why, from the point of view of so-called collective Putin, Russia now is at the initial stage of the war. For Russia, it is just an initial stage. That's why when ex-President Medvedev in one of his wild messages says that we are going to destroy Ukraine, if it's going to take us decades, then we're going to be doing it for decades. And he actually speaks not what he thinks, but what he is told to speak. So that's why you need to perceive those messages literally. So understanding that Russia doesn't have the goal to stop, and it doesn't have the need to stop, because from the point of view of Russia, there is no war going on. Somewhere there in the territory of Ukraine, there are some military actions, but before that, they had some military actions in Georgia, and before that, there were military actions in Chechen Republic. Somehow, all these wars, Russia mysteriously organizes these wars that from the point of view of Russia, there is no war going on. There are just some special military operations that are happening in the territories of hostile states. And Russia doesn't fight wars with anybody. So why to stop wars which are not wars? So in this sense, they can repeat what they did in the USSR. Just remember this international thing in Afghanistan that they did. And there were more than 100,000 troops sent to Afghanistan, and they called it they are paying this international debt. I remember very well journalist Vladimir Posner, who was interviewed on one of the American channels, and he was telling them that in Afghanistan, the USSR brought its limited troops to support the democratic government there. Some Americans and Europeans, they hope kind of a little bit that scenario of Russo-Ukrainian war will be similar to Afghan Soviet war, and that Russia will fight the war in Ukraine for 10 years, and in 10 years Russia will fall apart. But see, 10 years actually sounds terrifying. Yes, nevertheless, the war in Afghanistan lasted 10 years, but back then the time was kind of running slower. Yes, of course, and actually losses were very different. Back then there were 100,000 troops were fighting there. Yes, right. But Afghanistan had very serious losses. The Soviet Union lost 15,000 people, and Afghanists lost a lot of people, and statistics is many hundreds of thousands of people. And yes, of course, Americans, they hope that, as they say in that Arabic fairy tale, the donkey will die or the sheik will die for these 20 years. But let me repeat, I generally am not afraid that the support of Ukraine will be suspended, because this support is in the interest of the United States and the European Union and NATO. But of course, what's important, Americans give 50% of this support, and yes, quite significant support, and Americans give most important weapons to Ukraine. Yes, and of course, suspension of this support and delay of the support and reduction of the support, of course, is not going to improve the situation. And let's be frank, even the support that Ukraine receives today is not enough for Ukraine. And there are still airstrikes on Ukraine, and Ukraine loses its people and infrastructure. And frankly speaking, it doesn't depend on Ukraine to fight this war or not. Ukraine has no any way out. And Europe has no any way out. And the United States either. Because the threat that comes from the Russian Federation, it's a lethal threat, and this threat is deterred today, and as we can see it, is deterred by Ukraine only, yes, with help of Europe and America. So we've been on air for 1 hour. I think that it's enough for today. I think we touched on some very important subjects, and I'm sure it will provoke more discussions on strategy and tactics in achieving the victory of Ukraine, and I think it is discussed in some high offices in Kiev too, and I don't think their logic is too different from ours. We had today 20,000 viewers, and I hope all of you who are watching us, you will share this stream with your friends and you subscribe to our channel. Thank you, Yuri. I hope we'll see each other again and we'll speak about it more. Thank you very much and all the best to all of you. All the best.